Well, good morning. Welcome to the Revival Center YouTube page. We are so glad to have you with us this morning. I have Brother Aaron Limbaugh behind the camera today. He's going to be in the chat. So please, hey, I would love every single person who is listening to me right now. Go ahead, chat, say hello, say good morning. We would love to hear from you. We do this live stream just for the purposes of course, having this out there, but we do it live because we really do want to hear from you. We really do want to hear and interact in the chat. So if you do have any questions or just have any comments that you would like to have here on the live stream, make sure you go ahead and do that. We would love to hear from you today. And as you see, I am not Pastor Jason. Pastor Jason is on a hike. He is refreshing himself on a hike. And so I'm going to continue on kind of with our series that we've been going through of God and science. But hey, I would welcome you. Hit that subscribe button, like this video. We would love for you to be a part of what's happening here on the Revival Center channel, whether that is what's happening here on the Influence, what's happening in our services on Sundays and Wednesdays. We would love to have you, and the best way to be a part of that here on YouTube is to subscribe, and so we would greatly appreciate it. And so obviously, over the last few weeks, Pastor Jason has been laying out different reasons why we believe the Bible, why we believe that the earth had a beginning, about creation, about why this science and Christianity conflict, about a few things on it. And so before we really get started, I have a few things I'm going to go over. We're going to talk about, does the Bible teach that the earth is flat? So you have to stay tuned to listen to kind of what we say about that. But before we get started, I want to show a video. It's going to be of William Lane Craig, who is a Christian apologist, and he is debating this atheist. And it's a very funny exchange, kind of how it goes. But if you look at biblical evidence and try to fit it into, okay, what does it logically say, and you kind of parse it out, it's a really interesting debate, and I hope you enjoy it. So just go ahead and play that first video there.
500, if they really existed, did not suffer a mass hallucination.
Finally, the origin of the Christian faith, he says, maybe they came up with this idea because Jesus predicted his resurrection. But you see, the skeptic can't argue that way because the skeptical scholar doesn't think Jesus predicted his resurrection. They think those predictions were written back in after the fact. If you accept that Jesus did predict his resurrection, then you've got to also accept the historicity of the empty tomb narratives, the appearances, and so forth, because those narratives are better attested historically than the fact that Jesus predicted his resurrection. Do you see the point? If you accept the predictions, then a fortiori, you've got to accept the empty tomb and the appearances. And thus, I think we have good reason for believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be.
Now, as for the experiences, the appearances of Jesus, Dr. Craig said that I deny these. I do not. I do not deny that the disciples had an experience which they interpreted, which they took as being an appearance of Jesus. I think they probably did. Well, how do we account for that? How can we say that they could possibly have had such an experience? Well, once again, he far too quickly and dismissively disregards the explanation of hallucinations.
I think that this is really the central issue between us, because you do admit these early disciples had some kind of dramatic transformative experience that led them to believe now that their master was alive again, that he was not dead, that he was risen from the dead. And that's I'm sure you'd admit again too, this is an extraordinary belief that's very un-Jewish. It's very odd, and so we want to know, one of the points that I'm making is we want to know what's the origin of these men coming up with this belief, which they believed so strongly and so sincerely that they were willing to go to these hideous deaths for it.
Why do you believe that it could not have been a hallucination? Surely you know from the things I've said and from the extant literature on the nature of hallucinations, which I assume you've investigated, that hallucinations, as I've said repeatedly this evening, are often experienced by people as being extremely real. Furthermore, as I said in one of my rebuttals, precisely the conditions under which we expect people to have hallucinations are those which undoubtedly were being experienced by the disciples. Yeah. An extreme sense of alienation, an extreme sense of loss, a terrible reactive depression. It's been pointed out many times that, gosh, 1/3 to over 1/2 of the people who have been bereaved will have a waking hallucination of their loved ones that they have lost.
Yeah, but then they don't conclude that they're risen from the dead as a result of that.
Well, why not?
Well, but they don't. I mean, I'm willing to.
Remember, of course, they don't conclude that they are risen. Well, I'm not sure. We'd have to check and see. So once again, these extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In no way implies a bias against the supernatural. It's simply an application of a rule which we use in our daily lives.
But you're saying that when you say extraordinary, really what you're saying is no amount of evidence would convince me of these extraordinary claims.
Sure, it would. If tomorrow morning, immediately after breakfast, suddenly there was an earthquake, and a silvery light shone in the sky, and the leaves dropped from the trees, and I dashed outside, and there, towering over us like 100 Everests, was this giant figure with lightning playing around his Michelangeloid face, and he pointed down and saying, "Be assured, Keith M. Parsons, that I do in fact exist, and I'm sick of your logic chopping." Dr. Craig, I would join you in the pew of the church, in the front pew of the church the next Sunday.
Be going to the question and answer period. We're going to go to the question and answer period, so we'll be going to the microphone as we wind this down.
You don't think that you would have said, "Boy, I was having a hallucination."
So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did the first time I watched it. It's really interesting how William Lane Craig, who's still one of the foremost Christian apologists, kind of turns his reasoning back on himself of, if God came down and said this to me, I would believe. And he's like, wouldn't you say it was a hallucination? So I thought that was really funny, but it kind of displays, in a way, kind of a small picture of kind of where this debate takes place. Why do people put faith in the Scriptures? Why do people discern this? What does science have to say about the Scriptures? And so I want to talk very briefly before I get into the talk we're going to have today. As I was preparing for this, just a few things kind of popped in my head that I kind of wanted to discuss very briefly today. So the first one is how do we approach the Scriptures? And I think this is so important, is that the Bible is not a science textbook. And where some people get off and where some people start to misunderstand or worry or kind of try to figure out things, and there seems to be an impasse sometimes, is because they're trying to view the Bible as a science textbook. So we have to understand that primarily, now that's not to say that the Bible doesn't have any scientific things in there, but primarily what the Bible is the Scripture, is God's inspired word that reveals who He is and His covenant with the nation of Israel, that then expands through the cross to renew the entirety of creation. Okay? So it's a revealing of Himself, of His glory, and His plan for humanity. Now, are there other things involved in this? Of course there are. But if we miss the primary point, we can start to wonder and pull and pull out these small things and say, oh, well, what does this mean? Why this seems counteractive. And so I think that's an important mindset that we have to go if we see something like, let's say, for example, in a psalm, and we wonder, well, what does that mean? How could that functionally mean? And we try to parse it out in the sense of acting like the psalm is making a scientific statement about the world, when in fact it's using a metaphorical language to describe the greatness of God. You're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole kind of deal. Is that you actually, our approach to the text is what is seeming to create a problem in the text, not the text itself. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Because whenever we start to view the Bible differently than what the writer and what God inspired it to do, we're creating those issues. And this kind of harkens back a little bit. I don't know if any of you watching were here during our revival back in the springtime, but on that Tuesday night, Brother Danny Duval came and he did a teaching that was a little bit different than maybe a lot of revivals that we've been to. And he started talking about upper story and lower story. And so I'm not going to re-preach his message, but I think this is a very important point, is that he talked about the upper story being the supernatural, being, you know, the realm of God, and the lower story being science and reasoning and rationality, and that in the Enlightenment, so this is back 1800s, or 18th century, 1700s, maybe early 1800s. You have Rousseau and John Locke, different people that are doing philosophizing and having the Enlightenment happening in Europe, which of course spread. Well, what they did is they divided the world basically into these stories. And there was this kind of movement to be, you have one side of the story that's we're all rational, we're all determined by, okay, what is the physical, what is the material, and the other side is what is the, what is the spiritual, what is the emotional, and we act like they're broken apart. Well, if we approach the Bible in that same sense, we're not approaching the Bible from a biblical worldview. We're approaching it from an Enlightenment worldview. And so what ends up happening is we end up trying to fit the Bible into this upper story, lower story dichotomy, or we can just say the Bible has nothing at all to say about the rational or the scientific or anything like that. It's just this spiritual thing that has nothing to say about reality. And that's where a lot of people end up putting the scriptures. And so it's this rationalism that we end up trying to counteract with the text, but by doing so, we end up distorting the text. So what I mean by that is this, is that you have, let's just call them fundamentalist scientists, who say, well, all you have is the material, and so you, Christian, have to acknowledge that this material is what it is, and you need to conform. Then you have the fundamentalist Christian who looks and says, no, this spiritual reality is the real reality. You need to conform to this. When in the true biblical form is that there's no divide there. There's just the reality that God created the heavens and the earth. They're not separate. There's no sense of like, oh, we have to divide them into two different things because they're diametrically different. All of it is creation, and all of it is together. That's the biblical worldview. It's not that you have one spiritual realm and one physical realm, and then the physical realm's bad, so spiritual realm's good, and we need to avoid this to go to this. That's heresy. That's Gnosticism that says the physical is bad. No, God created the world and said it was good. And so when we know that then about creation, and we know and we believe the spiritual, it's not that we have to figure one out or make the Bible then conform to this rational way of thinking. It's that we have to understand that the Bible was written for an express purpose. And so we have to then see what is the Bible written for, what does certain texts mean as they were written. And so I know that was a little tangent there. I hope I didn't lose you. But I think it's very important because I find, and I've probably spoken about this more on this live stream than I probably should, but it's kind of a passion for me, is reading the text in the right way. You will have less confusion. You will have less times where we misuse texts, is when we read the text for the reason for which it was written. And so I just think that's so important. So as we approach this idea of God and science, it's the upper story, lower story divide. It's the Enlightenment principle that we're bringing to this that is the reason why we feel like God and science aren't compatible. See, that just doesn't make sense in the Christian worldview, because if God created the world, then it can't be incompatible with Him. That just can't compute in the biblical worldview. And so that's the case here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the question, does the Bible teach a flat earth? And so some people would say yes. Some people would say, I think the Bible does teach a flat earth. Now, some people would say that for various reasons. Some people would say that, let's say you're a skeptic of the Bible and you say, see, the Bible teaches a flat earth, therefore the Bible's wrong. Or you have some people who are like, well, the Bible teaches a flat earth, so the scientists are making up that the world is a globe. They're making up that the world is round. And so you have two different various extremes here. But let's look in that question. Let's dive into that question. Does the Bible actually teach this? So some people who would say that it does would cite Revelation 7:1. And so I'm going to read it very quickly. It says, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. So let's take a pause before I kind of explain our rationality. Let's go back to the question that I was talking about. What is the purpose that the text was written? So what is Revelation? What is the book of Revelation talking about? It's an apocalypse, okay? That doesn't mean it's about the end of the world, although Revelation does talk about that. An apocalypse is a revealing. So it's a prophetic book. It's a vision that John the Revelator has, that he sees, that then he is describing what he has seen in ways that he can understand it and vocalize it. Right? Does that make sense? So Revelation here is talking, it's a prophetic book. It's full, chock full of imagery. And so if you're talking about books that would have the most imagery, have the most metaphor, have the most comparison, Revelation would be way up there. So that already kind of is a little flag to me that says, hold on, this is a book of the Bible that we really need to carefully look at before we say that this is making any statement about the physical way that the earth is, because of the nature of the literature, right? If it's a poem versus a narrative, you're going to look at those differently. If it's a prophecy versus just telling about what happened, you're going to look at those very differently. And so we have to do that as well. But the way that that's looking at it is it's breaking up the earth into 4 points, or you could almost say 4 quadrants, right? 4 places. So when you look at it, that's a standard practice of navigation, right? North, south, east, west. It's not that we don't still use those terms because we know that the earth is round, right? It's of course, there's still north, south, east, west. We're not on a flat plane, but the quadrants are still the same there. So we look at it and we actually see that the Bible teaches that it is a circular object, that the Bible is not flat. I mean, the Bible's not flat, that the earth is not flat, but that it is a circular object. So we see in Isaiah 40:22, it says, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. So we see this is obviously expressing in very poetic language. It's talking about, the point of this verse is talking about how God is over the heavens, that he resides in the heavens, that it's over and he's enthroned above the earth, that he's not constrained, but he is in the heavens. So here, but it refers to the circle of the earth. We also see, and we see there, we look at the prophet Isaiah. I mean, he lived in the 7th century BC. So this is many, many years ago. We also see in Job 26, verse 10, it says, he marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. So here we have Job. This is the oldest book of the Bible, and it's very kind of difficult to understand some of what Job's saying because of the language. Like when you listen to that the first time, he marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. Okay, it seems very, very different. But if we were to look at an object, let's say we held up an object and we were to shine light to it. We were going to shine light on an object. What would an object be? What would I have to hold if I wanted a boundary between light and darkness? Okay? A paper, if it was flat, it wouldn't really do so. There would be no true boundary between light and dark, right? The light is hitting it and it's there, right? But if you held up a circle, a sphere, then there is that. You see the way that the light touches it is completely different. And you look at the book of Job, it was written 4,000 years ago. Now, it's very easy for us to take for granted that, oh, well, you know, of course the earth is a sphere. Of course, that's obvious. But that's not the case. When we look at history, that wasn't very obvious to them, right? They were like many different origin stories, many different peoples would have different takes on what it was. You would see in ancient Native American mythology that they would say that it was on the back of a turtle. You've seen different mythologies that would say there were 4 pillars. There were 4 pillars on the 4 corners of the earth. You would see them it on the back of other ancient animals. You would see the Greeks who had Atlas, who you're probably very familiar with the idea of the man holding up the earth. That's the idea of Atlas, who was a god who held up the earth. And so you see that, and so this was kind of the norm for the ancients, that not only were there possibilities of having it on 4 pillars and there being a flat earth, but that something was holding up the earth, that something, whether it be a god, whether it be a giant turtle, whatever it may be, was actually holding up the earth. But when we look at Job chapter 26, verse 7, it says, he spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. Okay, that's very, very different from what other ancients would have said. That the earth is suspended over nothing. And what do we see when we look at telescope pictures from the space station, pictures from the moon of Earth? It's obviously suspended over nothing. It is in space. And so by Job in chapter 26, verse 7, talking about the earth being suspended over nothing, this is very, very different from other ancient texts, because we see that this is so different. You know, when we look back, I kind of skipped over this part, so I'm going to jump back really quick, of when did we actually discover that the earth was round? It was proved around 1700 years after Isaiah and after Job, when we see in the 3rd century BC, the Greeks discovered that the earth was round because of the way that a shadow cast in a well. And so the way that the sunlight would hit and cast in the well, they were able to understand that then the sun was not connecting to an earth that was flat, but there was a curvature then to the earth. So we see then that many years later, it's showing what the Bible said in Isaiah, that the earth is round, that it's a globe. And so when we look at this, we see there then that with Job talking about the earth being on nothing, this is also a relatively new concept. Because of, like what I said, ancient sitting on the back of turtles, on the back of elephants, Atlas holding up. And so when we think of that, it's really interesting and fascinating that the Bible does not talk about any of those things. It does not talk about something having to hold the earth up. And like we said, in Revelations chapter 7, it says the four corners, but if I said, hey, I want 4 people to go in the 4 cardinal directions, to go to the corners, if I was sitting in a certain spot on the earth, and I said, I want you to go equally distant, east, west, north, south. I said, Aaron, go north. I said, Pastor Josh, go west. I told Angie to go east, and then I told Tabitha to go south, and I told them to all go to the same distance. Well, when you look at that, if they were all distant from the same point, they've made 4 corners or 4 quadrants, right? And if they went to that over the course of the earth, North Pole, South Pole, and obviously east and west don't have poles, but if they were the same distance from me, they've effectively made 4 corners, right? They've made 4 different points. But does that mean that the earth has to be flat for that to be the case? Absolutely not. So using Revelation 7, trying to use that as a proof text for why the earth is flat, falls a little flat, pardon my pun. But in the end, I think it's important to go back to the idea there in Revelation chapter 7 is talking about in this apocalyptic, in this language that is describing something that is very, very different. It is describing what the Apostle John, what John the Revelator is seeing when he is taken up on the Lord's Day. And so I think that is so important. So we're going to have one last video here before we end. It's video 3. But I think that when we look at this, when we look at all of this, we are asking the wrong question when we ask, oh, does God and science, does it counteract one another? We've been told this all the time. I remember growing up, it's Christianity and science are at odds with one another. Christianity and science don't go hand in hand. But I just don't see that biblically. I don't see that in the way we are looking at it here, is that we have to view the Bible in the way in which it was intended, in the way in which it was written. And we can't approach this from an unbiblical worldview and then expect it to mash up with what the unbiblical worldview is asking it to, if that makes sense. It's like let's say we have a friend. That friend is not from the U.S., that friend is, let's just say, from China. And obviously China has a different culture. They use different utensils, right? They might use chopsticks instead of a fork. They have a different language. Their homes are built a little differently. And then when they come to the U.S., we expect them to immediately act like they're from here. Well, that just doesn't make any sense, right? They're from a different culture. They're from a different place. Well, sometimes I think that's what we try to do with the Bible. We try to take the Bible, which is an ancient document, which is talking to an ancient people of a different culture, of a different language, multiple different languages, and we try to say, okay, Bible, be a modern science textbook. Go. No wonder, just as if we did that to the person, we will have some hiccups. We'll have some weird things happening if we do that to the Bible. Now, that does not mean that, the Bible has nothing to say about science. I mean, if that was the case, we wouldn't be doing this series. But in the end, we have to view the Bible that way, if that makes sense. So we're going to play this video. It is from a scientist and a Jewish Torah scholar, where he kind of talks about that tension of, how can you believe in what the Bible says and how can you believe science? And he talks about a little bit of the concepts that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, but how to him and in his view, it actually goes hand in hand. It's not a conflict, it actually goes alongside. So you can play that video.
My name is Gerald Schroeder. I have a, thank God, a strong science background from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, bachelor's, master's, PhD, 7 years in the physics staff, seen a whole range of atomic bombs detonated, moved to Israel, met my wife, Barbara Sofer, a great writer, and then teach Torah and science. So luckily, I'm lucky that I have the two that come together. And one of the questions that I'm asked as a scientist is, how can a scientist really believe that there's something what we refer to usually as God? You know, is this metaphysical whatever acting in the world or producing the world? And the irony is, the question's really a non-starter. Science has in fact discovered God. And you can talk to the hardline atheists and they will say, it looks like science has indeed discovered God. And how would that be? Well, if you take the trouble of going to the web and there type in WMAP, the initials for a satellite, it's a diagram that shows the development of the universe from the creation over time. It's a timeline. Every word on that diagram comes from the NASA site. It is the condensed knowledge of the scientific community of how the universe created and how it got to where we are today. Each of the lines, the vertical lines, is another billion years. Okay, you start from a burst of energy at the extreme left side of the diagram, and you end up at the far end with the oval. The oval is to indicate expansion in all directions. Of course, because it's a timeline, we can't show that on a single piece of paper. We see here, most amazingly, that on the extreme left edge, it shows a beginning to the universe. Now go back less than 50 years. If I were teaching that at Tech, a person could lose tenure saying that there was a creation of the universe. It sounds like it's Bible. Because less than 50 years ago, the overwhelming scientific opinion was the universe is eternal. There was never a beginning. The Bible is wrong from the very first sentence. And then we discovered, suddenly, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, the Bell Labs in New Jersey, the northeast of the US, discovered the echo of the Big Bang, the energy left over, which George Gamow, 60 years ago, predicted that if there had been a universe created hot and small, it would have exploded, and the energy would get more and more dilute. And Penzias and Wilson, these Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, discover this energy that had been predicted overnight. The Bible got it right. There was a beginning to the universe. Now, the black in the diagram is nothing. It's not a vacuum. Vacuums are within that diagram, within that cone of expansion. Vacuums are empty space, and space is something. The black of the paper around the diagram is nothing. It doesn't fit in our human brain because humans think in a box made of time, space, and matter/energy. No human, as clever as they might be, as expansive as they might be, thinks out of that box. So when we say outside that diagram is nothing, we can use the words, but we can't conceive of nothing. It doesn't fit in the human brain. How are we going to have this idea, is there a God or not? Notice that the creation force isn't a three-letter word, G-O-D. If you look at the words carefully, it's a quantum fluctuations. That understanding was first brought down by Ed Tryon, brilliant human being, in the journal Nature, almost 40 years ago. The universe allows creation of something from nothing, provided you have the laws of nature, the quantum fluctuation. Tryon realized, and he published in the journal Nature, one of the two leading peer-reviewed journals in the world, that you can create something from absolute nothing, provided you've got the laws of nature, quantum physics and the laws of relativity. In other words, the laws of nature. So look what science has discovered. We can create the universe from absolute nothing, provided we have the forces of nature. Now, the laws of nature, the forces of nature aren't physical, they act on the physical. So if they create the universe, that means they predate the universe. So now we have a set of forces, we call them the laws of nature, that are not physical, that are able to act on the physical. They create the physical from absolute nothing. And they predate the universe, which means they predate our understanding of time. Put that together, and it sounds very familiar. If you haven't noticed it, that's the biblical definition of God. There's only one nuance that's left hanging. We can talk about it another time, perhaps. Is that which created the universe, those forces active in the universe. But up to that point, science says, you are correct. The definition of the biblical God is predates time, outside of time, God is not a physical being, is a force, and it creates the universe. You'll notice that the opening chapter of Genesis, the only name for God is Elohim, God as manifest in the universe. Science has indeed discovered the biblical God, or we just need one part left, crucial. That which created the universe is also active in the universe itself. The very fact that you're watching this now pretty much establishes that point.
Yeah, well, I hope that was an interesting video for you. It's just one of the many examples of scientists who, through their research and through this, that actually led them to their conclusion that God does exist, that God in science isn't counteractive, but it actually reveals God. It actually reveals the Creator. And so I think that when we approach this, when we view this, we shouldn't come to it with the same tension that the debate seems to want to make it to be. Because when we go from that point, that's when we find a lot of issues. But when we actually just look at the information, look at what the Bible says and what the Bible was written for, we see that the tensions just aren't there. And so, hey, I hope this has been interesting to you. Pastor Jason will be back next week. And so I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure, hey, hit the subscribe button. We appreciate each and every one of you. Hey, like this if you enjoyed the video. And we appreciate you guys so very much. We'll see you next Tuesday at 8:30 a.m. God bless you guys.